Platoon is often described as an anti war film, and while that description isn't necessarily wrong, it is incomplete, however. What Oliver Stone constructs here is not fully a sermon against war nor a melodrama about lost innocence. It's something more enacting. I would argue it's a honest war film, one that treats morality not as some kind of virtue to be rewarded, but in some cases it can be kind of a liability. But none of this is clearer than how the film itself handles death. Because in Platoon, death isn't merely foreshadowed, it's fully structurally earned. Before we reach the iconic deaths like Elias or Barnes, and maybe even the collapse of the platoon itself, the film establishes its governing principle through a character almost nobody remembers, and that character's Gardner. During a early order scene, as patrol assignments are handed out with odd indifference, O'Neill pushes for the fresh people to be put forward for the ambush. His arguments are his boys are going to be going on R&R, despite it being his turn. I get what O'Neill is saying here, even if he is being a bit of a twat. Soldiers going on R&R are more likely to be distracted. Elias rightfully pushes back here, and his objection is not exactly emotional, but it's not because he feels hard done by either. Elias argues that the newer soldiers shouldn't be sent out because they need to learn something first. A point to note also is that Tex and Junior are taken away from Warren Squad, that's the Candyman, and oddly, this does change the course of history for the film by adding a weak link, which is Junior. This moment is kind of easy to miss because it is kind of staged without a lot of emphasis, but the film is quietly laying down a little axiom here. Elias understands what the war actually rewards, which isn't courage or obedience or even your morality. It rewards your experience or your practical knowledge. The ability to read your terrain, use the tools you've been given, how to move in the jungle without announcing yourself. And Vietnam, as Platoon presents it, doesn't kill you for being wicked, it kills you for being unprepared. And Elias's objection is ignored here. And almost immediately, the film cashes the check that it's just written. Anyway, the ambush comes, night fractures, etc., and Gardner catches it up. One of the newest men who's barely individuated and hardly even mourned. His death is very much abrupt. It's not sentimental or functionally visible to the machinery of the platoon. The narrative doesn't really pause here, and the system doesn't adjust. Just Gardner's kind of absorbed and forgotten, bagged and tagged. The only thing we really get from Barnes here is basically just a lesson to the rest of his men that if you don't pay attention and don't do your job, this is what's going to happen to you. I don't think Barnes is necessarily wrong here, but let's move on. Then Elias says something that clarifies a lot. Well, he says to Barnes or O'Neill, I don't really remember, I'd have to double check in the editing, but seeing as I've already written the script, he says if he'd survived longer, he might have learned something. Now, this isn't him being cruel or particularly callous, it's just kind of a diagnosis, really. It's just matter of fact. Elias is articulating a rule of the environment that they inhabit, that survival is your education, and education can only be paid for in time. And sadly, our boy Gardner didn't live long enough to learn that either. But this is where Platoon begins to do something far more sophisticated than simple realism. Because before and crucially around this moment, Elias is shown physically shedding weight from the newer soldiers, i.e., Chris and Gardner. So he lightens Gardner's load, and Gardner's also displaying a peace sign. Elias doesn't instruct him to remove it, only to tuck it in. Obviously, this is because it shines, but symbolically, Elias doesn't really care. He probably even agrees with him if you hear his speech about losing the war. Anyway, he removes excess gear, he redistributes equipment, and pares them down to what can be carried through the jungle, or at least on this ambush. On a literal level, this is just pure fieldcraft, but in Vietnam, weight does indeed slow you down, and weight exhausts you, and exhaustion gets you killed. But thematically, and this is where the film's symbolism becomes quite ruthless, is Gardner never gets the chance to stop being that dead weight that gets shedded. He remains exactly what the platoon has made him. He's an untrained body, insufficiently invested in, insufficiently taught how to carry himself. When the ambush comes, the unexamined burden, oh, lost my place, becomes fatal. And Gardner doesn't just die, he dies before he can become anything else. So when we talk about Gardner as dead weight, this isn't a claim of how the film values him as a human being, it's the claim about how the system does. The platoon hasn't deemed him worthy of knowledge or protection or even memory, but it just deploys him anyway. His death isn't random, it's structurally earned by neglect. This is why names matter so much in Platoon. Early on, there is an unspoken rule that Chris talks about. He says you do not learn someone's name until they've proven themselves, basically saying if they're likely to keep it. Identity itself here is provisional. To be named is to have survived long enough to be recognized as more than just a replaceable function. Also, Gardner dies before he gets to cross this threshold. Also, seeing his name seem to bear importance is a famous quote by Miyamoto Musashi, if I got that name right, said, "It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war." Don't know if that's poignant or if that was deliberate, but there you go. Alright, this first death kind of establishes the film's moral grammar. From this point forward, every major character's fate will operate according to variations of the same logic. Bunny, who treats violence as his form of self expression, or Junior, who evasions metastasize into whatever else happens to him without giving too much away. O'Neill, whose greatest ambition is getting some comfort and some R&R, and whose punishment is survival without ever being given that respite. Lieutenant Wolf, whose authority exists only on paper, not in practice, and whose refusal to truly see what's happening around him becomes very, very fatal. Barnes, who believes in the machine so completely that he turns it inwards, and Elias, who understands the machine and tries unsuccessfully to humanize it. And finally, the platoon itself, no longer a collection of individuals, but a single failing organism, consuming its weakest parts and mistaking the consumption for strength. Platoon doesn't ask us who dies. In Platoon, no one dies arbitrarily. Each major character earns not just their death, but a specific kind of death. One that reflects how they navigate power, fear, violence, etc. within the Platoon's ecosystem. If you don't believe me, do a quick thought experiment to yourself here at the end of my video. Swap the characters' fates and see if it fits. Have Bunny survive indefinitely like O'Neill. Barnes takes Junior's fate, so on and so forth. Anyway, without further intro, let's talk about our first case, which is a character that doesn't get a lot of mention in the YouTube analytical sphere, which is Bunny.
Tell you the truth, man, I like it here. Get to do what you want, nobody fucks with you. The only worry you got is dying. And if that happens, you won't know about it anyway.
If Gardner earns his death by ignorance, Elias earns his by refusal, then Bunny fully earns his by propagation. Bunny isn't simply violent, he is contagiously violent. What makes Bunny so unsettling and often so underanalyzed is that he merely doesn't commit atrocities, he pretty much normalizes them. He is not the ideological engine of the platoon, that role belongs to Barnes, but he is the accelerant or catalyst, if you will. Where Bunny goes, boundaries kind of erode and hesitation really collapses, so violence becomes easier, quicker, and a lot more intimate. And the film is meticulous in showing us how this happens. First, before we get into this, do you remember the brief speech Chris Taylor gives about learning people's names? Can I ask you a question? What's Bunny's real name? I can't be the only one that finds this interesting, and I understand Junior also has his cross to bear, but he's clearly named after his father. I mean, even Barnes gets called Bob, so I can't be the only one who finds it bizarre that they make a point about names and you never ever end up finding this bloke's name. Simply, he's just Bunny. Anyway, moving on. Early on, we see Bunny positioned almost as a mirror to Chris Taylor. When Taylor first smokes marijuana, the moment is framed as tentative and kind of communal, with all the men dancing together, which kind of is an attempt for these guys to dull the edges of fear and not surrender to it. Immediately afterwards, we cut to Bunny sitting on his bunk, music playing, beer in hand. The music announces that he doesn't smoke marijuana. The contrast is very deliberate here, whereas Taylor's kind of seeking some community and a bit of distance from the war. Bunny rejects that. He doesn't want to escape the war, he wants to inhabit it. The divergence comes to a head when we come to the village. Taylor, at this point, is acting because he's already fractured. He's humiliating the disabled man by firing at his feet. It's pretty ugly and hard to watch and kind of indefensible here, but this is also unstable because we know that Taylor's violence is kind of reactive here. He's effectively acting out of character. And when he stops because something in him still resists this completion, whereas Bunny, on the other hand, doesn't resist. He steps forward and finishes the act, beating the man to death with the butt of a shotgun. Not in any kind of rage or confusion, but he just does it full certainty. It's not kind of an escalation for this guy, it's just closure, it's just bringing an end to it. Bunny's violence in this moment doesn't really spike, but it kind of just resolves. And that distinction matters because that tells us exactly what Bunny is. Bunny isn't tempted into any of this because he's already there. If we look more at the costume design of him, his helmet reinforces this idea. Unlike most of the others, there's no slogans or ironic scrolls or attempts at myth making or weird eyes. Instead, it just bears objects like shotgun shells, an enemy scalp, which is just tools and trophies. Bunny does not wear any kind of belief, he wears consequences. His presence is kind of intimidation incarnate, a mobile signal that limits no longer apply to this guy. And this is why his closest friend, Junior, really fears him. Junior at no point mentions fearing the enemy abstractly. We know he does because of what he does in the final battle, but we'll get to that. But he does indeed mention being scared of being trapped in a foxhole with someone who has no internal brakes. Bunny is terrifying not because he might die, but it's terrifying being with him because he might not. Because he might still be there tomorrow, louder and more permissive than he ever has been. And when Crisis arrives, Junior does exactly what Bunny's presence has trained him to do, and he fucking legs it. This is where Bunny's influence kind of reveals its hollowness. Despite his dominance, Bunny inspires no loyalty around him. His violence radiates outwards, but nothing ever returns. He bodies up to Barnes and kind of smiles when he acts cruel, and he urges all kinds of escalation from characters like Chris. Not because he believes in Barnes' logic, but because Barnes' authority really gives Bunny cover. Bunny is a lackey not out of weakness, but out of instinct. He understands powers and adjacency. Not saying he even needs that power, to be honest. It is also unreasonable to see Bunny as part of the pressure system that enables Barnes' final betrayal of Elias. Bunny doesn't plan it, he doesn't execute anything. You don't see him doing sneaky behind the under the table deals or anything, but he does make it easier to imagine, and he just kind of turns that atrocity into background noise. But what I mean is, he's kind of in a small scene. He's kind of the devil on Barnes' shoulder. Literally just asks him a simple question, and with that, it's kind of obvious that that may be the final piece that Barnes needs to be pushed over the edge. Anyway, in the final battle, Bunny makes the only mistake his worldview cannot forgive, which is a soldiering mistake, and he calls out. Earlier, Elias lays down the rule: if you're separated, don't shout, because in this environment, sound betrays you. So silence is your survival, and it's one of the few axioms that the jungle enforces without exception. Money breaks it, not accidentally, but because he's doing his performance. He shouts Junior's name, he labels him a coward. Even in mortal danger, Bunny cannot resist asserting any kind of dominance. He chooses expression over his own survival, probably in just the heat of the moment, but whatever. And at this point, it causes the environment to answer back, and Bunny is shot, hit multiple times, rifle barrel forced into his mouth, the same gesture he uses to terrify others, and the trigger is pulled. But by then, Bunny almost certainly does not understand what's happening. Earlier, Bunny tells Junior that his death doesn't worry him because if it happens, you won't know about it anyway. Well, in this point, that belief is kind of fulfilled. His end's really abrupt, it's invasive, and it's uncomprehendable. And that's why Bunny's death is earned, because it's consistent with him. Bunny lives without reflection or restraint and kind of without meaning aside from wanting to commit violence. And his violence denies interiority in others and himself. So his death, in turn, denies him interiority in return. There's no kind of revelation here, no recognition, no final thought. It just kind of happens. And in a film that's obsessed with how people learn, adapt, or fail to adapt, this is Bunny's final lesson. A man who refuses meaning cannot receive it in the end. He's not punished, he's just kind of finished.
Somebody ought to frag his ass.
By the time Bunny dies, I'm no longer asking of whether or not he deserved it, but the question is if any other ending was ever possible. Bunny is a character defined by mode, not by motivation. He doesn't exactly need reasons to do what he does or justifications. He just acts because an action is available. Violence for Bunny isn't means to an end, it's just kind of like a language or an expression to him. It just shapes how he is ultimately answered. This is why his death isn't just violent, but it's specifically invasive. Now, the Viet Cong aren't going to ritualize his end here, and they're not going to moralize it, or they're not going to replicate his exact crimes, especially what he does in the end of the village. But they do meet him in the only terrain that has ever been recognized by him, which is bodily domination. The rifle is forced into his mouth is not sexual violence in a literal sense, but is the closest analog available in this kind of grammar of war, and is an act of total physical control. It's silencing and it's, well, for lack of a better word, penetration. Yes, yes, yes. Fucking hold yourselves together. Bunny has spent the entire film asserting that kind of control over others. His death speaks back to him in a dialect only he really understands, and crucially, it speaks without any kind of commentary. In other words, you aren't going to have him being R-worded to death. This is where Bunny's own philosophy kind of closes the loop. Earlier, he says that death doesn't frighten him because when it happens, he won't know about it anyway. So there's no real afterthought here or anything like that. His worldview does deny this reflection, and death denies it in return. He doesn't recognize his own ending. Looking at the state of him, it's unlikely he recognizes anything at this point. Not because he's spared pain or fear, it's because he's always refused that kind of introspection. Bunny lives outward, he's mega, mega performative and expressive, and in his shouts, his posturing, even how he would dominate space, and when the final moment comes, he's already past the point where that kind of awareness happens. In that sense, Bunny gets exactly the death he was rehearsing all along.
O'Neill, man, you worry too much. Sergeant take care of him.
Bunny's abandonment leading to his end is even clearer when you contrast it with a quieter, easily overlooked parallel earlier in the battle. So at one point, Chris Taylor's foxhole buddy, Francis, wants to leave, and Taylor tells him that he can go, that he doesn't actually have to stay with him, and yet, paradoxically, that permission is what makes the man stay. Given the option, he chooses solidarity. He chooses to risk his life with someone rather than what Junior does. Bunny, however, doesn't allow for that choice. Junior wants to leave and he wants out of the war and out of the foxhole, but Bunny doesn't give the permission that Chris gives. And why is that? Well, first of all, Junior doesn't ask, but that's because Bunny scares him and he doesn't have the same confidence in Bunny as Francis has in Chris. So that's the final distinction. Whereas Chris creates a kind of trusting gravity around him and people are feeling free enough to ask for things, or rather to be honest with him. Bunny creates a kind of repulsion, which people flee from him whenever the going gets hard enough. So when Bunny shouts, when he breaks the silence to assert dominance one last time, he's not making a mistake, he's just kind of being himself. And the war answers back honestly. Sound, as you know, creates location, and location makes you a target. Bunny doesn't die because the war is cruel. He dies because his way of I might leave that sneeze in. He dies because his way of surviving cannot survive contact with itself. Forever at least. And that's the film's most unforgiving idea. That some forms of adaptations are so complete and so successful that they leave no room for any other ending other than annihilation. The man was chaotic evil, and this was his logical terminus.
Redneck noise, dude. That's all it is. Make about as much sense as you do. All them chucks be rapping about how they losing their hope. Saying how they ain't got no bread for beer.
Junior for me was the most obvious example of the cause and effect I've been trying to push for this entire video. The rest could end up being my own imagination, but Junior's here does feel pretty undeniable. So, one detail that's pretty easy to overlook is that the ambush isn't our first warning, our first interaction with Junior. It's the second, maybe even third, if you count the opening scene where he has no lines but is fast asleep on patrol. I feel you, mate. I feel you. The film has already quietly positioned him as a problem in the initial interaction with Chris Taylor. Junior tells him to keep digging whilst he sits on his arse doing nothing but smoke. The task may have been assigned to all of them, but Junior has opted out. Please ignore my rabbit. More telling is that the confidence in which he does it. He isn't afraid of Taylor, so he doesn't bother negotiating. He just simply asserts that someone else is going to carry the load. At this point, it's Chris. From the outset, the film establishes Junior as someone who understands how to dodge effort, responsibility, while projecting a lot of assurance. And that groundwork really matters here because when the ambush arrives and Junior deliberately falls asleep on sentry, it doesn't read as a tragic lapse or him being exhausted. It just shows his consistency. This isn't a man who's overwhelmed with any kind of circumstance. It's a guy that's already shown us that when given the choice between participation and avoidance, he chooses avoidance every time, even when the cost can be gravely paid by others. During the night ambush, Chris Taylor wakes Junior to tell him to take watch. Junior acknowledges him and then, without hesitation, goes straight back to sleep. I don't feel you, mate. There is no confusion here. Junior just simply opts out. In that moment, the entire platoon is effectively left unguarded. When the ambush is over and the consequences become unavoidable, Junior's first instinct is straight to deflection. He immediately attempts to shift blame onto Taylor, claiming that Taylor was the one that fell asleep. This is reflex, it's not anything else. Junior's relationship to accountability is already kind of fully formed by this point. Nothing that ever happens to him is ever his fault. There's always an external force or an unfair system or a cosmic pressure bearing down on him. And Barnes does see through Junior straight away. Junior is punished, but tellingly not in the same way that Taylor is. Barnes does yell at Taylor, who's the new guy, but also stares at Junior. He and Elias make Junior carry Gardner's body, but the message is clear. Barnes understands that the failure was most likely Junior, but he doesn't have time or resources to have a conversation, ging gang, or whatever you want to call it, or even a kangaroo court. As the film progresses, it's shown that Junior has gravitated around Bunny and Barnes, not because he shares a similar worldview, but because their proximity gives him a lot of cover. Bunny's violence does embolden him, and Barnes' authority a lot of the time shields him. Junior is only brave when somebody else is louder or stronger than him in the room.
You see, y'all be trying to keep the black man down and string him out on that shit. But the time be's coming, my man, when the black man throw that yoke off. Simple. Free your mind, your ass will follow.
Yeah, I could dig it, man. Not like a piece of pussy. Except maybe you need 500.
Only way you get some pussy, man, is a bitch dies and wills it to you. And then, maybe.
You don't want to talk, mate. You're a fucking rapist. Anyway. In Junior's quietest scene, he complains about oppression and about forces that are out which his control. And later, he talks about not being able to take it anymore. And while these grievances may have real historic weight, what matters here is how Junior uses them. They become a totalizing explanation that absolves him of any kind of agency. If everything is rigged against him, then nothing he does matters. So his responsibility really just dissolves here. So in his own mind, Junior is the eternal victim. And that victimhood really manifests as childishness. There is a scene where he wants to drink from the river until someone stops him. Now that I mention this, I think Junior may have actually realized that drinking water from the river would indeed make him sick, but he would do it anyway as a way to escape Vietnam. Judging by his past, present, and later actions, I believe that is a way that he was looking to get out of it. This is an editor's note as well, by the way. I put this in after I wrote the original script. If it feels kind of chopped and out of place, then that's why. Interestingly enough, as well, because I'm a huge geek that can't get through a point without telling you another fact that I know, Willem Dafoe does exactly this on set and had a similar consequence. Moving on. Later, Junior rubs a substance slightly mosquito repellent, as Barnes refers it as skeeter repellent, into his feet, attempting to feign an injury severe enough to warrant an evacuation. This isn't any kind of bravery from Junior's part. It's very much a self-sabotage, and Junior crucially only moves on from this when an alternative is worse. When he finally snaps and says he can't take it anymore, that he'll walk, it isn't because he suddenly has a come to Jesus moment. It's the suggestion of a threat. When Barnes tells O'Neill to grab a centipede, then and only then does Junior actually start acting. Junior also admits to being afraid of Bunny because Bunny, well, let's be real, is capable of anything. That his proximity to him also may have been a grave mistake. That and the fact that Bunny is also an unhinged lunatic who commits war crimes like you pick a flower, but yeah, whatever. Isn't really how you should be really feeling about your closest friend, the guy that you have to share a foxhole with, but I'm getting too sidetracked here. Even during the village raid, Junior participates in atrocity only because Bunny is there. So in a sense, he borrows courage from him and only acts when the power balance is present. Remove Bunny and Junior collapses, which is exactly what happens in the final battle, metaphorically, kind of, sort of the other way around, whatever. Before the centipede scene, Junior looks over to Bunny for reassurance, but Bunny only shoots back a twisted smile. Theoretically, he's already lost Bunny because he never really had the man to begin with. Look at it this way, imagine looking to your closest friend for reassurance. Not only do they not defend you in any way, they actively look excited about your suffering. So when the fighting starts, Junior runs away and he abandons Bunny. He abandons sharing the foxhole with him, and in doing so, he confirms everything the film has been telling us about from the beginning. When accountability arrives, Junior chooses to get the hell out of there. And Bunny, as we know already, calls him a gutless shit. Now, I spoke earlier about Francis choosing to stay with Chris, probably ensured both men's survival, as they were able to effectively support each other, both physically and morally, obviously. Junior leaving Bunny exposed a chink in the armor, which is quickly exploited, and this is where Platoon becomes almost uncomfortably explicit. Junior's death isn't random. He isn't shot in the chaos or taken out from a distance. He's stabbed directly in the guts, up close, and it's very, very personal. The choice right here, I am going to argue, is way too precise to ignore. So, courage, historically and linguistically, is located in the gut. Your guts or your bravery, basically, your resolve and the ability for you to endure. And Junior, before, is described as gutless, both implicitly and explicitly. He dies from having his guts taken from him. This is not metaphor laid on after the fact, this has already been structured. Junior spends the entire film externalizing fear and dodging responsibility and surviving by proximity to stronger men. When he finally has to face violence alone without any kind of top cover or without any kind of permission or someone strong enough to absorb any kind of consequences for him, he can't endure it. So he dies effectively the way he lived. He's close to the danger, but he's never equipped for it. He's aware of it, but he's very, very unprepared. And I'll say one thing finally on Junior as well. He doesn't die because the war is unfair. He succumbs to it because of his choices. And in a film obsessed with learning with who adapts and who refuses to, Junior's death is one of the clearest examples of the lessons that Platoon ever tries to offer. Junior spent his life avoiding responsibility, and responsibility arrived all at once by an angry Vietnamese guy with a bayonet.
Lieutenant, why the fuck didn't you do something?
What are you talking about?
You know what the fuck I'm talking about.
No, I don't. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, Elias.
Bear with me, everyone. We're nearly there. Lieutenant Wolf occupies a precarious position within the platoon. He is effectively the man in charge, but he enters the platoon carrying many of the same liabilities as the newest replacements. Newest soldiers. He is ranked without any kind of experience and responsibility, without any form of authority, and his reflective instinct to avoid confrontation. Wolf isn't exactly a malicious guy, but he is dangerously ill-equipped for the role that he occupies. Oliver Stone does a great job of showing how young this man actually is. When he's introduced, he's wearing a wrestling t-shirt from high school or college. Don't know really how America's schooling works. His helmet has artwork from Mad Magazine and the words Unease Orphan. I say Unease because I can't see the other letter, but if someone knows more, I'm happy to find out what the hell it means. I have searched at length to find out what it's supposed to mean, but you know, turning up a whole lot of nothing here, so I'm taking an educated guess. If you know better, please do let me know. From early on, Wolf does indeed govern passively. Barnes becomes a functional center of power, not because he usurps his command or anything, but because unknowingly Wolf actually allows him to. Authority for Wolf is something to be worn rather than exercised. And this is despite in the early order scene, Wolf asked Barnes for him to give the final command to the men, so that way they know he's in charge. Despite asking Barnes who to send out in the first place instead of telling him. Yes, that's how it works in this environment, but Wolf in this case wants to have his cake and eat it too. That failure of command heavily manifests in a tactical form later, when Wolf calls in an artillery strike using incorrect coordinates, resulting in friendly fire. His own men are killed by his mistake here, and Barnes, rightfully so, openly scolds him for it. The error exposes Wolf's most serious flaw. He can't accurately read or control the battlefield he is responsible for. Remember this part for later, please. The film does not dwell on this moment, but it does indeed plant seeds for later with clarity. Wolf's problems aren't confined to tactics, they extend into a moral terrain as well. During the village raid, when Elias confronts Wolf about Barnes' conduct, Wolf insists that he saw nothing. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's an abdication. Wolf chooses ignorance as a shield because acknowledging what happened would force him to act, and he avoids responsibility by denying any kind of perception. Also, remember this for later. Even visually, the film underlines a contradiction. Wolf's helmet bears down drawn eyes. It's a crude symbol of vigilance and awareness. It suggests oversight and watchfulness, command, and yet Wolf constantly fails at the very thing that symbol implies. He doesn't see clearly, and when he does see, he declines to respond. Again, remember this, please. Socially, this weakness is equally visible. During his rank, despite his rank and predatory name, Wolf behaves like prey around people like Bunny. Bunny crowds him and intimidates him, performs dominance, whereas Wolf responds with nervous humor and effectively retreats from him. Rank collapses in the face of Bunny's, appetite. And if you want to get poetic about it, the Wolf yields space, the Bunny takes it. Just some extra info. This isn't exactly relevant to Wolf nor Bunny's fate, but I thought it was interesting that the names seem very carefully chosen here. By the time the final battle begins, all the failures seem to converge. Artillery is called in again, this time in desperation rather than error, and explosions tear through the perimeter. Wolf is struck by shrapnel and debris, and he is blinded in the same form of fire he once misdirected. The same weapon system he previously failed to control. The symmetry here is quiet, but it's very, very unforgiving. Disorientated and unable to assess his surroundings, Wolf is shot by an enemy he never properly sees. This isn't narrative irony for its own sake. It's kind of completion, really. Wolf's habit has been avoidance and avoiding confrontation, mental clarity, avoiding full engagement with the consequence of his own decisions. When death arrives, it arrives from outside his perception, delivered through the very mechanism he once mishandled. Even his name sharpens a contrast. The Wolf survives through awareness and coordination and decisive movement. Wolf, the man who survives on paper authority and procedural installation until, that paper burns away. He dies because command without competence kills indiscriminately, and eventually it kills the person issuing the orders. In Platoon, like in life and the Bible, by the way, looking away is also never neutral. It is simply a slower form of participation, one that ends eventually with the war looking back at you. In the end, what happens to Wolf is not a symbolic punishment so much as an inevitability. For most of the film, blindness is something he chooses. He claims not to see the village atrocities, misreads the battlefield. He defers to others rather than confront what is directly in front of him. Vision for Wolf is optional, something that can be denied when it becomes inconvenient. The final battle removes that option. Artillery strips him of his sight entirely, turning metaphor into condition. What Wolf once performed rhetorically, ignorance as installation, is now imposed physically. He is forced into a state where he has been rehearsing all along, disorientated, dependent, and unable to assess threat or consequence. When he's finally killed, it's not by an enemy he recognizes or danger he understands, it's by absence of his perception itself. In Platoon, Wolf doesn't simply die while being blind. He dies because blindness has been his method of command from the beginning, and the war eventually insists that he lives inside of it.
I mean, sometimes I just look at a guy And I know this fella's not gonna make it.
Just no fucking way.
Come on, I never asked you for a fucking thing over here. You know, I was thinking maybe... Well, to be honest with you, I was hoping you'd put me on that chopper with King out of here. What do I say there, Chief Rooney?
O'Neill is the only major figure that I'm going to be talking about who doesn't actually die on screen. That doesn't mean that he escapes the film's moral logic, however. If anything, O'Neill's fate is more precise because it denies him his resolution. His ending isn't a release, but it's an extension. It's a Shakespearean survival, if you will, where it's described that a brave man only dies once, whereas a coward dies 1,000 deaths. From the start, O'Neill is positioned as Barnes' closest ally. They address each other by their first names, which is Bob and Red, showing a familiarity between the pair, which signals more than a friendship. It signals a big alignment here. O'Neill understands where the power actually resides, and he's put himself comfortably next to it. He enforces Barnes' will and echoes his contempt and helps stabilize the informal hierarchy that sidelines Wolf. Early on, this confidence expressed itself as cruelty, disguised as pragmatism. During the ambush where Gardner's killed, the same ambush that Junior falls asleep in, by the way, O'Neill is one of the first people who confronts Chris Taylor. His line is dismissive, and he says to him that excuses are like assholes, everybody's got one. It's not about getting, to any kind of truth or anything else. It's just about containment, about being seen as being hard line on the troops. Responsibility has to land somewhere, and Taylor in this moment is the easiest place to put it. Interestingly enough, though, that philosophy about excuses does indeed come back to haunt him. Anyway, as the film progresses, O'Neill begins to lose the people he's oriented himself around. One of his friends, Sanderson, is killed in a booby trap near the bunkers. It's an abrupt, kind of meaningless death that offers little to no warning. Others are blown apart, scarred, or simply gone. Barnes, the man O'Neill has built his identity around, also denies him R&R when asked for it. The mission comes first, and any kind of bad feeling or comfort is deferred. O'Neill also is derisively referred to as super lifer by King, and this insult cuts deeper than it initially appears. Everybody else is either a volunteer or a conscript, so they're counting days, rotations, tours, etc., and it has an endpoint. O'Neill, by contrast, has no outside. This isn't someone passing through. This is his job. This is his career. The implication is kind of quietly horrifying here. If death and end of days are the exits from Vietnam, then O'Neill's survival traps him inside of it. This indeed makes the final battle even more crucial here. When the perimeter collapses and O'Neill ends up alone moving through the perimeter with several VC nearby, maybe 20 in number, I wasn't really counting, and he takes the only kind of logical response, which is pulling a corpse over himself and hiding beneath it. This is probably initially read by a lot of people as cowardice, but the film itself also refused this judgment in an earlier scene. King, the man that referred to O'Neill as super lifer, says outright to Chris, there ain't no such thing as a coward out here. So, therefore, would it also apply to O'Neill? You could agree so. Could agree to. So O'Neill does what anyone would probably do when there's no chance left. He survives the only way that is available. When what matters is not the act, but I would say what comes after. Remember earlier that I said about how he isn't a fan of excuses? When O'Neill emerges, the first instinct he has is an explanation. He says that everyone left and that his guys were gone. What he actually says is those bundles of sticks, they all left me. If you don't know what I'm saying, Google bundle of sticks or another word for bundle of sticks. Those are his exact words. And again, he isn't lying here. Barnes is absent, Bunny's dead, Sanderson's gone. The network that sustained him has indeed collapsed. So O'Neill does what he always does. He reframes his circumstance as some kind of justification. Technically, he's also right. As I said earlier, he mocked excuses as meaningless. Now he lives inside one in a career that's going to sustain him his entire life. That's really, really harsh now that I think about it. There's also a quiet parallel earlier that sharpens this kind of irony. O'Neill remarks that when he's playing cards inside the bunker, almost casually, that Wolf isn't going to make it, that he can just look at people and he can tell. And Barnes shoots him a look, not necessarily in disagreement, but kind of almost, I don't know how to describe it other than saying accusatory, and that he believes that Red isn't going to make it. And in reality, it's actually something harsher. Red makes it, but he dies more than anybody else. And it is probably one of the cruelest fates within the film. But yeah, moving on. After the battle, O'Neill is speaking to the captain. Before he can even ask for leave, he is handed second platoon, which to most people, this is a promotion and could be looked at as a really good thing. Well done, you. But for him, it's a continuation. The war doesn't release him, it absorbs him more fully. Command isn't a reward here, it's a obligation imposed without consent. Another thing worth mentioning here is body language and tone. Through the entirety of the film, O'Neill is very jerky and brash. The only time you see his tone completely change is when he asks Barnes for leave or when he speaks to Captain Harris. Furthermore, in this position, O'Neill comes across as quite a bit of a yes man. And this is eventually what really does betray him. He comes into Barnes, positions himself close to him, maybe hoping that it's going to help him out in some way. Maybe being close to the boss is going to be a good thing. Maybe speaking nicely to Captain Harris and not asserting himself or putting forward what he actually thinks might actually get him what he wants. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. And now he's already set the groundwork for everything else that's going to move forward for him. So the more I look into O'Neill, the sadder his ending actually becomes. To be honest, I think an ending that would have actually probably been a kindness would have been if he went out fighting the VC. But unfortunately, that isn't how reality sticks. One final thing as well before I move on to the harder nut to crack, which is Elias and Barnes, is when you see the aftermath in the morning, you see Charlie Sheen holding a grenade. Oh, sorry, Chris Taylor holding a grenade, and he's willing to drop it at his feet. And you also see Francis, the man that he was sharing a foxhole with, jab his own thigh with a knife. And that's what gets him extracted. You don't see O'Neill doing anything like this. So he's willing to hide under corpses, but he isn't willing to deliberately injure himself to get him out. I don't know really what to make of that, but I think it is an interesting point to note nonetheless. Anyway, as many people will say that I did say earned their deaths, in the thumbnail as well, there's many crosses over people's faces, but there isn't one over O'Neill, is because he dies 1,000. And unfortunately, sometimes the cruelest sentence that war can pass is continued survival.
We're gonna lose this war.
I am reality.
Come on. You really think so?
Barnes is probably the most prominent character who initiates his own death long before it actually happens. Everything that follows Elias's murder, the collapse of the platoon, and Barnes' own execution begins with Barnes deciding that leadership must be preserved at any cost, even if that cost is unthinkable. What makes Barnes difficult and interesting is that his decision doesn't come from indifference. Barnes, bizarrely, cares deeply about his men. That much is undeniable. When Gardner dies, Barnes disciplines the platoon harshly, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. This is actually tough love. His attention here does actually save lives, and complacency, if he chose to be complacent, would kill. Barnes understands that immediately. He is also the one who sends the new men out in the ambush, including Gardner. That decision wasn't framed as malice, but as his doctrine. You learn by doing, or you don't learn at all. Barnes believes that survival is exposure, even if that exposure costs lives. I know this isn't explicitly said, but that is also true. I also want to remark upon that sending people out onto an ambush that are going on R&R the next day can also be equally as dangerous as sending people out there that have little to no experience. But that's a bit of a different topic, and I'm sure you can argue with me in the comments about it as well. When Sanderson and Sal are killed by the booby trap, Barnes does not grieve publicly. He retreats and cries in private. This matters because it's proves that Barnes is not incapable of emotion. He is incapable of showing vulnerability without losing authority, and his grief kind of has nowhere to go here. Then Manny is taken and, well, butchered. This is his breaking point, and Barnes, when he arrives at the village, immediately after being found crying, one of his men is being mutilated while his back is turned. The enemy is no longer abstract, it's intimate and humiliating and incredibly enraging. Bear in mind as well that Taylor even said himself that today they love Barnes. Anyway, in regards to the village, the evidence of VC collaboration is thin. but Barnes no longer cares about standards of proof. He is operating under siege logic. If it doesn't, if he doesn't assert dominance now, he believes he will lose what remains of the platoon. Granted, this doesn't justify the village atrocity, but it explains his volatility. Barnes is acting from a place of wounded authority, of compounded grief, and a lot of fear of losing control. And then Elias threatens everything. I'm going to do a brief pause as another editor's note here when I say that the collaboration of the VC is thin. Yes, they found weapons, munitions, and enough rice to feed an entire army. What I'm trying to say here isn't that the village isn't showing signs of harboring weapons or collaboration. It's more of is the collaboration willing or not? And you could overproduce rice because I'm not an expert on Vietnam. I don't know how the seasons work. I don't know if it's easy to grow rice at a certain time of year. I don't know how long you keep rice for. And if they're a farming village, it kind of makes sense that maybe they would want some rice, maybe to trade for whatever else. The weapons, however, does appear to look like a smoking gun. Although having them there, it doesn't prove that the village is willingly participating. Willingly might seem like it's doing a lot of heavy lifting here, but you can't really prove that the Vietnamese, or I, this village, isn't held hostage by the VC the same way that they probably would be by the Americans if the Americans got to them first. So it's probably a survival strategy for the village. Nothing's really fully explained by the film, so you see the weapon stash, you see the rice, and Barnes puts two and two together. And whether or not his answer's right, we don't even know. Moving back to Elias, his involvement. So, as Elias threatens everything, there's a potential court martial that hangs entirely on Elias's witness account. Barnes understands the stakes immediately. If Elias reports what happened, Barnes is removed and his leadership collapses. The hierarchy that holds the platoon together will disintegrate. In Barnes's mind, this is absolutely unacceptable, and he takes the only logical move, which is Elias has to go. Elias makes his own mistake here. He assumes Barnes is still operating within boundaries of comradeship. When he encounters him out in the middle of the jungle, he smiles. He approaches as if the argument is still theoretical, but then Barnes shoots him. The act doesn't end the problem, it creates a new one. In the bunker, which is known as the underworld, the space where Elias's group gathers, Taylor and the others discuss killing Barnes. Now, fragging is not abstract fear in this theater, it is absolutely real. And by what I mean fragging is by being killed by your own men. And Barnes is very well aware of this. I mean, Bunny directly says it to him earlier that someone ought to frag his ass, referring to Elias. I'm sure the clip is in this video at some point. This is where Barnes's decision becomes mega crucial, and Barnes chooses to enter the bunker alone. He doesn't bring O'Neill or Bunny, or he doesn't even bring Wolf. So he doesn't threaten or, well, he does posture in a way. He presents himself as vulnerable deliberately. And I do generally have to ask myself this many times: what does Barnes stand to gain of visiting the underworld after he killed Elias and is openly telling them that he killed Elias? He's there to gain control. It's not an apology, it's kind of a challenge. I mean, in a way, it could also be his penance in an odd way. I mean, after shooting one of your men dead, I'm sure you're going to be dealing with a lot of mixed feelings. It's also, in a way, a challenge. Barnes is saying without saying it, if I did it, and if you're fucking hard enough, do something about it. It is an attempt to flush out dissent before it metastasizes. Barnes is too dominant for this group to act collectively. Only one person, Taylor, even tries. Barnes overwhelms him and is only stopped by the threat of a firing squad. In Barnes's mind, this is the problem squashed. Weeks or months pass, time blurs as it does in war, and the platoon continues wounded, but it's functional. Barnes believes at this point the danger is past, so he can maybe look over his shoulder again. And this is Barnes's final error. When we finally get to the eve of the final battle, Barnes attempts to kill Taylor with an entrenching tool. It may not be exactly preemptive, but it is certainly opportunistic, and it's clumsy and mega desperate. The act now confirms what has already been true for some time. Barnes no longer trusts pockets of his own men. He's now ruling through elimination, not cohesion. Finally, when the morning comes, and like Elias before him, Barnes doesn't register the danger standing directly in front of him. Despite everything, the murder, confrontation, even attempted killing of Chris the night before, Barnes still assumes that he's still an ally and still manageable beneath him, etc. And then Taylor finishes Barnes with an enemy's weapon, which is an AK-47. And this kind of turns Barnes' logic inside out. The man who believed violence could secure order is killed by violence that no longer answers to him. In the end, Barnes's death is not a portrayal of his character, betrayal of his character, but it's fulfillment. Everything Barnes does, disciplining the platoon, pushing his men into danger, unleashing violence on the village, killing Elias, is driven by a single conviction. He alone must hold the platoon together. He believes that leadership requires decisiveness without hesitation, even if that decisiveness crosses into the realms of atrocity. But in acting to preserve the unit, Barnes systematically dismantles the only thing that can sustain it, which is trust. By killing Elias, who would have been one of his second in command alongside O'Neill and the Candyman, the moral counterweight, the man who actually balanced authority with restraint. Barnes does more than silence a witness. He proves that loyalty under his rule is conditional and it's also revocable. From that moment on, the platoon is no longer something Barnes leads, it's something he rules through fear. His death completes that logic. Barnes isn't killed by an enemy, but by one of his own. A soldier he consistently underestimated, a peripheral presence he never took seriously as a threat. That Taylor uses an enemy's weapon to do it is also not incidental. In that moment, Barnes has become his enemy, and Taylor responds accordingly. Taylor later reflects that the platoon was born of two fathers, both Barnes and Elias, and it is fitting that one of those fathers must die so that the son may live. The irony now is completely total. Barnes did everything to hold the platoon together, only to become the one thing it cannot survive. His death mirrors Elias's not just structurally, but thematically. Both men are killed by the platoon's internal war. But where Elias dies refusing to abandon moral sight, Barnes dies believing control could replace it. What remains of the platoon does not endure despite Barnes's death, it endures because of it.
He believes in what he's doing.
And you? You believe?
65? Yeah. Now. No.
Elias is different from the moment he appears. He's not morally superior in a kind of sentimental way. He's not naive, and he certainly is not innocent. But he's misaligned with the environment that he does indeed occupy. Where other men in the platoon are in the process of being shaped by Vietnam, Elias already appears fully formed. He knows the rules, he understands the violence, and crucially, he understands when not to apply it. Elias holds the rank of sergeant, and the film makes it clear that the man has actually earned it. He's not new to combat, he volunteers for tunnel duty with minimal apprehension, a job that requires not just courage, but a very real intimacy with death. From reading the book on killing, I'll definitely agree that it's probably one of the scariest positions you can put yourself into. He kills when he must, and when he does, the film often underscores it with music that feels ritualistic rather than triumphant. Pipe tones occupy his violence, leading to an almost funereal quality. Killing for Elias is never celebratory, it is something endured. This is why his moral stance in the village matters so much. Elias almost certainly feels the same rage Barnes does after Manny's death. The difference is not emotional, it's about their outlook. Elias doesn't externalize his grief into any kind of domination, and he refuses to turn pain into permission. When everybody else breaks, Elias holds. That, to Barnes, makes him intolerable. Earlier, Elias demonstrates the same ethic during the order scene. He pushes back against sending inexperienced men out on the ambush, not out of any sentimentality or of it feeling unfair that it's not his turn yet. He understands that survival is learned. It's not out of instinct. And when he's overruled and the ambush results in injury and Gardner's death, Elias offers a quiet, devastating observation. If Gardner had longer to live, he might have learned something. That isn't just him being a prick or giving an opinion, it's a fact. And Barnes quietly does indeed hear this as an accusation. Elias's greatest threat isn't opposition, but it's clarity. He sees what Barnes is becoming, and he doesn't look away. When he confronts Barnes in passing, not theoretically, not publicly, he makes a mistake that seals his fate. He assumes that truth once spoken still has some kind of currency, when it doesn't. Not in this environment. Barnes kills Elias not because he's weak, but because he's uncontainable. Elias represents a form of leadership that Barnes cannot neutralize in any way, because Elias commands loyalty without any kind of fear, and he maintains authority without domination. And the platoon needing to be increasingly governed by force, especially with the threat of a court martial and Barnes's removal, that force is definitely destabilizing. I know it's been said before, but there is a strange, almost mythic uh, layering to Elias's position in the film. His group congregates in a bunker referred to as the Underworld, which is a space beneath Earth removed from kind of the official worlds of men. And it's kind of populated by men who no longer fully belong to the institution above them. If this is hell, it's a quite really chilled out one. Marked not by cruelty, but by kind of withdrawal and kind of brotherhood. I don't really know which other words I can use to describe this area. Barnes's domain, by contrast, is the surface. It's uniform, it's the official war, the side that claims moral legitimacy by inheritance. After all, this is the army that fought the Nazis. It's supposed to be the good guys. Yet, this is an area where the good guys rationalize atrocity. Whether or not Oliver Stone intended a theological critique is almost besides the point here. What matters is the inversion. Elias behaves like what we expect a hero to be. He's brave and restrained, he's also protective, and he is the one that gets cast out. Barnes behaves like how the system rewards. He is decisive and brutal, and he's unyielding, and he is elevated until he destroys himself. Elias dies because he cannot adapt anymore to a system that requires moral blindness to function. He does not refuse violence, but he does refuse corruption. And in Platoon, that is unforgivable. Elias doesn't die because he's careless or because he's weak. He dies because a man who sees clearly cannot survive in a platoon that has decided not to. His death is not random, it's necessary to remove a standard that the platoon no longer wishes to meet. Elias appears to be the other side of the moral horseshoe to Barnes, is that they're both doing the exact same job, almost in the exact same position. Yet, how Elias thinks and feels about it, he only kills out of necessity, whereas Barnes really does what he believes to pull the platoon back together. In one of Elias's softest scenes, where he's talking with Chris Taylor at night, he remarks upon how he loves stars and how that there's no in between or good and evil with them, they just are. He also says that back in 65, he believed in what he was doing and he believed the same way Barnes did. Maybe there was a different Elias out there that would have sided with Barnes, which is really weird to think about. Now, there would have had to have been an event that would have changed him, something that would have made him think and act the way he does now, which is probably why the Elias ended up getting the martyr's death, is because Elias was the one that chose to sacrifice himself for the sins of the platoon. Probably why he gets the ending he does. And then when you look at the flip side in contrast to Barnes, Barnes doesn't die with his arms in the air or with a giant fanfare or anything else. His is very sudden and it's in the mud and it's over with, blink and you miss it. That's the difference between the two of them, is that despite both of them having the exact same circumstances on the outside, one of them chose to be a better human being, which is why his death was, well, better. The other chose what he chose. And the smartest thing is that both these men, until their dying breath, would have thought that they were right. When I started pulling this film apart character by character, I kept asking myself the same question: how much of this was deliberate? Did Oliver Stone consciously design each death as a moral endpoint, or am I just imposing structure where a coincidence just happened to align? The more I looked, the less that distinction seemed to really matter, because whether these endings were meticulously engineered or merely emerged organically from character and circumstance, the results were the same. Platoon feels internally coherent in a way that resists accident. There's simply way too many alignments here, too many mirrored choices, repeated motifs, and consequences that land with uncomfortable precision. For the film's deaths to feel interchangeable, each character exits in a way that reflects how they navigated power, fear, responsibility, and violence. Some die violently, some die quietly. One survives to live on forever, and discovers that survival can also be its own sentence. Even when the film appears chaotic, it's never careless. Behavior accumulates and choices kind of echo, and endings genuinely do feel earned here. That doesn't mean that this reading is definitive in what I'm saying. In fact, the opposite is true. Part of what makes Platoon endure is that it rewards you a lot of return visits. You can come back years later and notice new details, new tensions, new implications hiding in plain sight. Interpretation isn't a mistake here, it's participation in it. It's part of what makes films stay alive. And that ultimately is why close reading, or at least close reading of this kind, matters. It's not to prove any kind of intent or to solve the text, but to give attention to the craft, the performances, and the bizarre alchemy that turns a war film into something that still provokes thoughts decades later. As a fan of Platoon, which I'm sure you can obviously guess, and of films that trust their audience enough to be uncomfortable and contradictory and unresolved, it's a genuine pleasure to sit here with these characters, to follow them to their ends, and to ask why those ends feel the way they do. Some films end, others invite you back. In the end, I'll leave you with Chris's speech by the end, and hopefully I can make it sound like I've not just been waffling shite this whole time, because it might confirm what I said. If not, I hope you had a wonderful time. I worked hard on this video. Keep watching the skies.
We did not fight the enemy. We fought ourselves. And the enemy was in us. The war is over for me now, but it will always be there the rest of my days.